that we're recommending refer this report to the Cultural Impact Assessment Project Working Group for their information. And then our conclusion was that there is no specific recommendations from these two particular resource consents that warrant any recommendation to government about change of the RMA. Remember, we're just focusing on these two particular resource consents, but I'm sure that will be something that comes up in the questions and discussion. So in summary, just the overview of this is our review team of 3 has very carefully considered all of the evidence that we can get. Our conclusion is that due process was followed, that the decisions that were made were open to those making the decisions. In other words, we as I said at the start, we weren't there to make a judgment about whether they made the right or the wrong decision. Our question you asked of us to look at was due process followed? And the implication of that was that a reasonable decision that they could have come to in the light of all the evidence that's available? And our conclusion was that it was. So the recommended improvements that we're making to the process were resource consent application summaries, training for the West Coast resource consent team, standard conditions on carry dieback, service level agreements with biodiversity operations and biosecurity teams, offering training to local board members, working with local boards after each election to review triggers, referring the report process to the Cultural Impact Assessment Project Working Group, and that we saw no particular issues that warrant recommendations to government on RMA reform. So, Madam Chair, I wonder if I could just pass over to my colleague Dean Kimpton, who might want to comment on some of the operational level issues which he's been looking at.
Okay, and then we'll take questions on the whole kit and caboodle.
Thank you.
Dean.
Sure. So what I thought was an appropriate opportunity is to talk about some of my reflections on what we've learnt as a result of this process, not to the substance of the decision, not to the substance of whether the right decision was made around notification, and subsequently to the decision as to whether to grant or not, but what we learnt from looking at the documentation on the process that sat in behind that and what we can do better as a result. So I'd like to talk to that, and I will shortly, but there has also been a number of other matters raised which I thought would be useful to comment on, including the status of the current consent, the independent review, and potential acquisition. So I'll talk to those, but I'll talk to those after I've given my take on those internal processes. So what have I learnt? And like I said, once again, this is not the substance of the decision. This is what we need to do better together again, so that we can make we can ease up the process of considering and engaging with the community around resource consent applications. So the last month or so has allowed myself and a few others to look at what occurred in there, and personal reflections on it, and these are my personal reflections. I've discussed them in part with some of the leadership, is the process that we undertook and the duration. It was clunky and it was long, okay? And some of those internal communications between parts of council wasn't as good as what it could have been, and there's a whole range of reasons around that, but I'm acknowledging that I think we need and can do better again. And that frustrated, you could see in the correspondence, that frustrated members of the community. You could see in the correspondence that frustrated the local board, and you could see in the correspondence that frustrated iwi, and it frustrated the applicant too. So in all of that, and keeping in mind, I'm not talking the substance of decision making, because the independent review has already found that that things were in order there. What will we change? And for me, that's part of the reflection. You've had a number of recommendations that Roger and the team have touched on, so we accept those recommendations, okay? What I'd like to add into that is just a couple of reflections. One is that we've already shared through finance and performance that the regulatory team, so I'm talking about building controls, resource consents, licence compliance, is looking systemically or holistically at how it does development approvals. And that, we're putting that into place now. It's live work in the process. But what we've learned out of this experience builds into that. And quite simply, we'll take a more of an end-to-end approach on it. There'll be a case-managed approach, and we expect, as a result, things to be simpler and quicker. We have taken on board the feedback around clearer communication with local boards, iwi, and the community, and how we receive that feedback and incorporate it and make sure that it's clearly communicated. But I will touch on this application separately. And clearer language so that triggers are more clearly understood and that particularly ease the workload on local boards, that where we can, we more clearly identify matters that we know are of concern for them. Keep in mind, across Auckland, there's some 15,000 resource consent applications, and in the west, there's about 1,900 to 2,000. So there is a large volume, and I've got sympathy for all those involved in it, so we need to be able to do this more efficiently and more effectively. Whilst there's been some reflection from the local board around training, that is general feedback from local boards. They would like further training on the resource consent process, what they need to look for, how they need to engage with that. So it may be in this instance this local board doesn't feel that need because they're better informed, but that is something we'll do with local boards as a general principle, and I think that was a good recommendation. Likewise for the local, staff, particularly in these areas where we've got areas of SEAs, or in this case the Waitakere Heritage Protection Area. So those are comments that I want to make. I don't want to repeat all the recommendations that Roger has made, except that we acknowledge in this instance the application took too long. We're addressing that. The internal comms and escalation of issues didn't happen as well as I'd like it to. We understand that, and it was a clunky process, so I want to acknowledge that, and that's the purpose of me speaking specifically to that issue. There has been a few other matters raised which I thought were useful to touch on, and I'll start off first of all with the independent review. So there's two reviews, one that Roger and team have led, thank them for that. The other one was, I felt that irrespective of what the findings of that were, there was a case for having somebody independent, in this case Janet Clues, who's well known to that part of the community, to have a look and say, well, sure, we've got a consent, consent's been granted, but we've got to break down the relationships between the community and the landowner. What does the way forward look like? And so Janet's role there is to start stepping through that and identifying how we might come together. And if we can, what does that look like? And if we can't, acknowledging and understanding that. So I'm not creating false hope here, but it's very important that we step through that and with an objective of coming to some agreement. There's been discussion around acquisition. The purpose of that process that Janet's leading, the independent review, is not to figure out what the price of that land is. There are some 1,200 lots in that area that are currently vacant, and if we start buying one, we're theoretically up for another 1,200, and if you apply that principle across Auckland, it is an unaffordable solution. So I'm not recommending that on behalf of council, and I was quite consistent on that in the early days of this particular issue. If other parties figure out how to get to that, then of course we will consider that, but I'm not recommending that for council or for the local board. And I've given you the context as to why I think that's not an affordable response. There was some question around were the local board concerns heard and how was that reflected through the independent commissioner. And I just thought it's worth touching on those. The local board, so on there's two lots, number 40. On number 40, concerns of neighbours, there was another lawyer and the local board were communicated to the independent commissioner. That information was available to them in the decision making around notification and granting. And on number 42, Mark Bellingham, Michael Savage, the local board and neighbours were also provided. So that feedback was provided as I've been advised. The last one is the status of the current consent. As before, we're quite clear, the consent granted stands. And, but the owners have agreed that to go and figure out what they want to do, and they've agreed to go through this independent review process with Janet Clues. So they want to work with the community, see if they can come to a landing. Nothing at this stage that we've heard through the independent review or legal review suggests the process was flawed. It was fraught, but not flawed. Judicial review is a possibility, and I've heard that discussion from time to time, and if that's the case, then we'll cooperate fully with it. But nothing has materialised at this point in time. So that's the end of my comment, and happy to take questions on that in the course of the discussion.
Okay, so I'd like to deal with questions first, and then we'll move on to the recommendations, and I've got another recommendation to add to that. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, officers. Could we have the picture of the aerial of the site up there, please? Now, if I'm not mistaken, to the right, we're looking at the Manukau Harbour. You right? Yeah. So what I haven't seen is any mention or emphasis that this property and those trees are growing in the coastal environment. And there's two significant aspects to that. Kauri growing so close to the sea, ecologically speaking, is extremely rare, only metres from the high tide mark. The other aspect of it is, because of its location, it is in the coastal environment, which means it triggers Part 2 of the Resource Management Act, Section 6, matters of national importance, including inappropriate subdivision and development in the coastal environment, a matter of national importance. So I think the lack of emphasis or acknowledgement of that is quite significant in the circumstances. Thank you.
Oh, that, Councillor Lee.
Can we get a response?
Well, we just need to, I was just waiting to see if Ms Pirrett did want a response, remembering that we are looking at the lessons learnt on how to work through these consents. We're not reviewing this particular consent. But Ms Pirrett, do you wish to respond to that?